Good morning to Latin America, good afternoon to Europe and Africa, good evening to East Asia. After the outbreak of the pandemic, ICOM has immediately responded to this challenge for the museum sector. With the help of our network and partners such as Interpol, ICOM published statements and recommendations regarding funding, security, online activities, and others. A survey in April and May gave an overview about the situation of museums and professionals around the globe. Most of the museums around the world were closed. Many of them, more than 50%, increased their activities in social media. The long-term consequences, however, will be a completely new and hard challenge. 83% of the respondents expect museums to reduce their activities, 30% expect museums to reduce staff, and 13% expect museums to close permanently. Therefore, ICOM has started a second phase of activities and launched a series of webinars developing strategies for the future. The first online seminar, after a first online seminar together with OECD, the next webinar looked into the reopenings, exchange and experience from countries where museums are already open again and countries where they are still closed in Asia, Europe, Africa, and Latin America. Streamed in ICOM's 3 official languages, English, French, and Spanish, it reached 3,000 viewers around the world, 14% in the USA, 8% in Mexico and Brazil. The webinar today is called Local Communities Strengthening Museums, and it will look into activities with and for a local public, programs, and other activities. We will again offer you simultaneous translation. You can choose your language by pushing the button at the bottom of the page. And you can use the chat for asking questions. And now, everybody, please start with this seminar. Thank you for coming.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and thank you so much, Peter, for welcoming everyone. This third seminar, as Peter said, is going to deal with the issue of local communities strengthening museums. As everyone here is aware, it is a very difficult and challenging time for museums globally, not just for museums, but also for the communities, societies around museums. When it comes to museums, it's a given fact that visitorship to museums have gone down dramatically to maybe even less than 1/3 in most cases. They say that the public spending for this sector has also gone down dramatically. Some say even up to 60%. 1/3 of the museums might really struggle to open and stay open. Now, in the midst of all this, a lot of museums have been very creative in what they've been doing to make sure audiences come back, they connect back to the communities. We have 4 excellent panelists today who are going to share a little bit of insight on a range of things, including how to strengthen the relationships between museums and communities, how to increase the impact of museums and increase visitorship, and also provide more sustainability for museums. I'll start by introducing the panelists. Our first speaker is going to be Bonita Bennett. She is the former director of the District 6 Museum in South Africa. She'll be followed by Kenji Saotome, who is a curator for the Suita City Museum in Japan. He's also a board member of ICR. Our third panelist would be Paulina Roblero, who's the co-founder of Vamos al Museo. It's in English, it says, let's go to the museum in Chile. And our fourth panelist is Carol Rogers. She's a director of the House of Memories program at the National Museum in Liverpool, UK. Each panelist would have 4 minutes to make their opening comments. And after that, we'll have a round of questions, both from me and from the audience. With regard to the audiences, I request that you all please type in your questions in the chat button if you're on Zoom. if you're on UCAT TV, please type in and I'll get a copy of your questions and we'll put some of this across to the panel. And as Peter mentioned, I just want to remind you again, simultaneous translation is available. So just press the interpretation button for the simultaneous translation. So let me pass it on to the first panelist, Bonita, to make your opening comments. Bonita.
Thank you, Vinod, and thank you, Peter, also for those opening comments. Thank you to Marie for this invitation to be part of a conversation which I think we will probably have some answers to and many more questions that we have to answer in the practice of solving our crises in different parts of the world. So as you heard from Vinod, my name is Bonita Bennett, and I've been involved with the District 6 Museum for just on 20 years. 11.5 years of those have been as its director. And I stepped down from that position in January of this year, just before the devastating impact of the COVID-19 pandemic was being felt globally, and a mere 2 months before South Africa was declared to be in a state of disaster and the level 5 extreme lockdown was put in place, something we would never have imagined to have happened. Our world changed, the whole world changed. And I often find myself wondering if my decision to step down might have been different if the threat of the pandemic's impact was more apparent on our side of the globe. But that's a subject for another reflection, personal reflection that I have to go through. I'm transitioning into a new role as a research associate and #1 friend of the District 6 Museum, which I continue to love and which will really forever be part of my life. I'm in the process of becoming a part of a different aspect of this museum's community in a different capacity. So in a nutshell, this museum is located in Cape Town, South Africa, on the edge of an inner city community, which was diverse and vibrant in the days of and before apartheid. The area, District 6, was declared a whites-only area under apartheid legislation, and like many other residential areas that might have been largely occupied by Black families when such declaration occurred, people were forced out of their homes and they were moved to barren areas far from places of work, far from the places of learning, and also of their traditional associations. This museum emerged from a movement in the 1980s, which was committed to asserting and supporting people's rights to remember and to return to the areas from which they were displaced. It was formally launched in the period that we think of as the post-apartheid New South Africa, which was inaugurated in 1994. District 6 Museum was born on International Human Rights Day of the same year, the 10th of December, 1994. So who is this District 6 community and who is the museum talking about when they think of the community? Who is this community that should be supporting the museum? And I know that the topic of communities, of visitors, of stakeholders, audiences, publics, it continues to be a hot topic in museum circles. And in addition, the word community in South Africa has come to signify poor residential areas. When we talk about more affluent areas, they are usually referred to as neighborhoods. But the District 6 Museum continues to think of community very much as it was used in the days of the struggle against apartheid, where it is an indication of a stance of empowerment, of solidarity and strength more than a geographical ring fence. So when District 6 Museum talks of community and being a community museum, it is more of an orientation than a physical place. So the immediate community of District 6 are the people who are dispossessed, the people who are returning, and then as the circle of community widens, there are many other people who've become part of that, who are either have themselves been forcibly removed from other areas, or people who support the kind of ethics and values and work of the District 6 Museum. And I think not to underestimate the devastation of this pandemic, but given the fact that the District 6 Museum was born out of a sense of struggle and under apartheid, and given that it has gone through a number of its own challenges, including financial challenges, it has built some kind of resilience. And I think although all the answers of what the recovery plan is going to be has not been fully thrashed out. There are some clues, and I think I will come back to that in response to specific questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Could I ask the next panelist, Kenji, to make his opening comments, please?
Hi, hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, thank you very much, Vinod and Peter and colleagues from the Secretariat. My name is Kenji Saotome, working for the Suita City Museum in Osaka, Japan as a curator. Suita City is located in the outskirts of the city of Osaka, and it has a population of 370,000. The museum opened its door to the public in 1992 and gradually became community-oriented museum after 2004, which is the year Dr. Koyama from the National Museum of Ethnology in Japan became the director of the museum. In this short presentation, I will introduce 3 cases that the local community ended up strengthening our museum. One of the biggest changes that the museum saw was Dr. Koyama initiated a program that community members can engage with the museum activities, such as participatory exhibition program, that community members can participate in the planning and running of. Examples of such exhibitions include Henry Newtown exhibition and Expo 70 exhibition. The program was quite a success in the increased number of visitors to the museum, which received 22,000 visitors in 38 days of the period of Henry Newtown exhibition, whereas until the year before the exhibition, average annual visitors year was approximately 10,000. It was also a success in the contents of the exhibition by putting on exhibition on the basis of community participation. The content of the exhibition tends to become the one that better reflect the reality and wishes of the community members as a whole. Let me introduce other cases of the museum's community engagement trials that I initiated. Last autumn, a leader of the resident association of the historical housing complex in Suita City contacted me to ask me if the museum wants to have a model of the housing complex that was made by a group of university students only 10 years ago. I gave him a condition, which is to hold an event to hear what the residents of the housing complex have to say about their life and their social history in relations to the model of the housing. In this way, the museum can not only store the model of the housing, but also the narratives, stories alongside with the model. Last case I will talk about is something which is underway. Under the pandemic, I started collecting objects, documents, and photos related to COVID-19 since mid-March of this year. And I decided to hold a small exhibition on COVID-19 this summer, and they are on display now. The process of collecting objects was quite simple. I asked as many community members as possible, especially the local leaders. What I mean by leaders doesn't necessarily mean the title. It means people of character and people of virtue and people who naturally gather others around them. And I have been working for this local museum for the past 10 years. So I know exactly who the local leaders in this in the community are, and their contact numbers as well. So I called them and asked them to spread the information that the museum is collecting COVID-19 related objects. So far, I have collected more than 1,500 objects, documents, and photos. What is important here is also collecting narratives of their sorrow, pain, anger, reality, wishes, and hope alongside with the things that I collected. All the cases that I talked about were something to do with the local community engaging with the Suita City Museum. For the museum curators, knowing the community members better can lead to strengthen the museum more. For the community members, it is important to have a sense of belongings and ownership to the museum. For the museum, it is important to secure an access and accommodate them, whoever, whatever they are. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kenji. Can I now request the next panelist, Paulina, to make her opening comments, please?
Thank you, Vinod. Thank you, everybody. Hello, hola, Mari. My name is Paulina Roblero. I am the co-founder of Vamos al Museo, BAM, Let's Go to the Museum. And also, only a month ago, I was for the last 5 years the head of the Communications and Audience Engagement Department of the Museo Chileno de Arte Precolombino, the Chilean Museum of Pre-Columbian Art. I want to start by sharing with you some questions that I've been asking myself as a museum worker, as an art worker, some questions that are inconvenient, and I think that we all should be thinking about them regarding the crisis. And the first one that I've been thinking about is, can people live without museums? And the answer, like it or not, is that people can, and they have been living without museums the last couple of months. In this crisis that we are all living around the world, we had information from UNESCO and ICOM that more than 10% of the museums worldwide can maybe never reopen, and people are going to live without those museums. But are their lives going to be the same? How can they manage to continue? How can we, as museum workers, as art workers, make these museums, these places that are going to be alive, be essential to people's lives? Or as the Museum Association in England says, museums change lives. So we have to be responsible. And how can we manage to do that? Or what kind of museums we would like to be? Because things have changed and it's time for radical times of change. So we have to get to know our community, and we have to get to give them the space to be them, the creators of these new times that we're living. I think that we have to be more open to believe that we can work and build a stronger society if we can work along with the people and society, having them to create the new narratives, having them to create the new things that people are worried to see. Do we want to see more blockbuster exhibitions? It's a museum experience, or we want to have a museum experience related to one piece of art, for example, the Mona Lisa, surrounded by thousands and thousands of cell phones, or we want people to have life-changing experience and maybe to work with more smaller museums. In Medellin, Colombia, the worker staff of the Pedronel Museum, they developed an amazing project called Como Pedro por su casa, like Peter on his house, where the collection of the museum went to the neighborhoods, and they were their houses a little piece of the museum. So we have to understand that now museum boundaries have changed. Is the museum the physical space? Is it the walls surrounding them? How can we take place and work in the public space? How can we be part of the people's lives in their houses? Another example is what happened here in Chile. Museums have been shut down since October, and they nearly get to open a couple of months in the summer, in January and February. Because of the social crisis, an amazing initiative came up called El Museo de la Dignidad, Museum of Dignity, where a bunch of young creative people gathered and took all of the cultural manifestations around the city and the public space, and they put frames around it and made the city an open museum. So we have to rethink and question ourselves what kind of museums we want to be and how are going to get involved people. So I would love to have the answers, but I think that these times are challenging us to make us questions, to challenge ourselves, to see beyond our walls, and to open our eyes and open especially our ears and listen to what society has to say and how can we involve them in these changes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paulina. Before I invite Carol, just a quick reminder to everyone. I think a small number is watching this through Zoom. Most of the people are doing it through UCAT TV. Please type in your questions, because just after Carol finishes, we'll have time for questions. Thank you. Thank you, Carol.
Thank you, Vinod. Thank you for inviting me to this really important event and discussion. I am the director of House of Memories, which is an education programme created by National Museums Liverpool in the UK. And it was specifically designed to support people living with dementia. We began in 2012, and for the past 8 years, we have promoted person-centred care to support people to live well with dementia. Now, you might ask, why is a museum concerned with this as an issue? And I would suggest to you that museums are experts at looking after memories. Some of our memories are iconic and thousands of years old, but yesterday was history. And when you are diagnosed with the condition of dementia, quite often you have limited capacity to remember what's happened today, but you may have recall for memories that are in your early childhood or early adulthood. So it made sense to us as a museum group that we could make a connection with this very important group of elders. 850,000 people are diagnosed with dementia in the UK, but as you all know, wherever you are based, this is a global challenge. Our aging society and people living with dementia is going to continue to grow right across the world. And I suggest to you that museums are well placed to support this community of elders in a very special way. We are excellent at providing knowledge and understanding about people's lives and life experience. And this can be an incredible, personal, valuable tool for communication. Within House of Memories, we've created a number of really important initiatives. One is around using the traditional museum experience of memory walks in the museums or objects in suitcases that you can handle and engage with. But really crucially, and never more so than today where we find ourselves with COVID-19, we also looked at a new way of recreating the museum experience digitally. And this was because at the time of development, we recognized that within residential care settings and healthcare settings, the handling of objects was really challenging with regards to infection control. So we took the model that had been a physical model and we redesigned it digitally, and it has been massively successful. We've created a new museum experience designed for a specific community that has reached now more than 32,000 people who have downloaded our app. Around that model, there's a training program because we recognize with lots of our elders, there's a digital divide in terms of confidence to use tablets and technology. So we made it our role as a museum, again, not a traditional role for us, to create an opportunity to enable elders to engage meaningfully with technology, 12,500 people in the UK have engaged with our programme, and that's been really successful. Our approach to House of Memories was different to any other education programme that we designed. We co-created the model with the experts, that's people living with dementia. And it was important for us to learn from them what would work for them as a community in terms of connectivity with digital objects. And it was also important for us to manage their expectations as our stakeholders. We were on a learning curve as well, and we were completely honest about that. We didn't position ourselves as the expert. We positioned ourselves as an organisation that really wanted to develop meaningful partnership. And by doing so, we recognised and acknowledged that we needed to learn as well. So we had to change our approach to digital representation of collections. And if you download our app, the My House of Memories app, you'll see that it's a very different approach because it's been influenced by the very people we were trying to serve and support. It was unusual at the time in the UK, and this is back in 2012 when we started, for a museum group to take a direct and active interest in the lives of people living with dementia, specifically around developing resources just for them. And our journey for the past 8 years has been an evolving story of connection, digital exchange and opportunities. House of Memories has provided insights into the social value of collective partnership and cross-sector working. It's promoted the positive impact of public service alignment. House of Memories is partnered with GP surgeries, with acute care hospital trusts, with social care providers right across the UK. And it's elevated the importance of community well-being through arts and cultural interventions. I would suggest to you that it has absolutely repositioned the value of our organisation as a sustainable social asset for older people, their families and networks. It's never been more important to support people who remain vulnerable and socially isolated and shielded as a result of the coronavirus pandemic. For these older people, the My House of Memories app and similar digital tools have provided a unique way to connect with them, to share their memories and their hidden histories, and to enable a renewed connection between neighbourhoods, families and community networks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carol. Thank you also, Kenji, Bonita, and Paulina. We had 4 excellent opening comments. We'll have a bit of time for discussions and questions. I encourage everyone who's watching this to type in your questions. We have a few to start with, so please do type in more questions. I think I also saw a very interesting comment. I think it's Ralph from the Slovene Ethnographic Museum. He's made a comment saying that they've been collecting Corona humor in terms of jokes, and people like it very much. You know, that's great. Now I've got 3 questions for the panelists, so I'll ask them one by one. And if each of the panelists could take maybe at the most 30 seconds to answer each question, otherwise we'll run short of time. So the first question is, if you need to pick 3 aspects that museums could do to strengthen its relationship with communities, what would they be? You could just list out 3 things that you think are important. We'll go in the same order as your presentation. So we'll start with Bonita.
Okay, so one of the things I would think of would be linked to all the speakers, but particularly Paulina, who said, look up and listen. And I think that's very important. And I think just in terms of the way the District 6 Museum is, it's actually developed some very good strategies for listening to people rather than coming with answers. I think museums must find that balance between giving leadership and also being led by by leadership and wisdom that exists outside of the broad museum network. And I think thirdly, I think it's about deepening conversations about prejudice, about stereotyping, about stigmatism, stigmatization, sorry. I'm not sure if it's happening in other countries, but in South Africa, certainly there is a little bit of stigma being attached, but who infects who created the virus? Are there different classes of people who are more prone to that, and all the other kind of ramifications around that? So influence, letting the public program also reflect some of those discussions.
Thank you. I'll pass it on to the next panelist, to Kenji.
Okay, I will try to be simple. First, to get their phone numbers, and to eat, drink, communicate together. And lastly, to keep discussing with them for new ideas. That's pretty much all I can think of. You know, basically communicating and discussing, and gaining a trust from them is very important.
Thank you. Can I pass to you, Paulina?
Sure. For me, the three key things are empathy. We as museum workers and the museums as live subjects of narratives have to be able to be on the shoes of the people, to understand and to hear their problems, to be capable of opening up the doors in a symbolic and in a physical way, but to let them in, to really let them in, not to be objects of use. Solidarity is fundamental in times of crisis. We are art workers, but we are social workers, and museums have a social responsibility to gather around people and to give them trust. We are not the barriers of the truth, the absolute truth, but we can provide spaces of trust where people can feel safe, when people can believe on what we are doing, on what they are doing, and what we can build together. And I think that the most important thing is diversity. Today we have to see that the narratives and the creation of new exhibitions or new relationships has to be letting and concerning about diversity in all of their forms, regarding gender, regarding cultural background, regarding race. So it's really important to consider these three fundamental aspects to work with along with the community.
Thank you so much, Paulina. Carol?
Apologies, I lost my unmute button there. Just to add to the great thoughts shared by colleagues, I think the relationship has to be real. I think that our mission to be inclusive and to connect with communities has to weave through the whole organization, curating, collecting, conservation, education, front of house services. It's we can't create a two-tier effect of exhibition and display that is different for communities. It has to have equal status and equal commitment, and it must be for everyone. And we do ourselves and communities a great disservice if we don't demonstrate a real commitment to an equal relationship. The worst experience I think a community group can have is to find their ideas and their engagement with you hidden away in the back of the museum in a quiet education room somewhere. It has to be up front and center alongside your major exhibitions and your major events. It cannot be a poor relation to what we may perceive as our main program. So I think the relationship, a real relationship, is key. I think we have to break out of our buildings. That would be my second recommendation. We live in a world of immense productivity, and our audiences are motivated to be the designer, the curator, the producer, and the promoter. And this provides opportunities for us, but also challenges. And we must learn how to connect, to listen, and understand how people want to engage with their cultural heritage. We are only the caretakers of their culture. And my third recommendation is about environment. I hear a lot around how difficult it is to be inclusive and accessible. And quite often that's around the environment, the physical environment of the museum space. And that always comes down to cost and affordability. This mustn't be a barrier. And in my experience, we can adapt where things are possible. And if cost isn't a consideration, we must be honest and transparent and communicate this to our audiences. People understand the reality of cost to make accessible improvements. They do this every day in their own lives, and they will work with us to achieve shared goals as long as we are honest and transparent and can manage their expectations.
Thank you, Carol. My next question, I'm going to join this with one of the audience questions too. See, at this time when museums are really struggling to get visitors in, and the focus is also more on local visitors than international visitors. What can small museums do to make this a reality and get more local visitors? And are there any structural changes one needs to do within the museum to make this a reality? So again, we'll go in the same order, if that's okay, Bonita.
Okay, thanks, Vinod. I think I might need more than 30 seconds for this one. But I think, and this is very much, I'm very much aware of context and the way and the kind of museum that the District 6 Museum is. So in its particular context, the business model that it's built on is one that doesn't really speak about visitors at all. It's one that speaks about participants, and in a broader sense, users. And so, and it's always people are put, the participant base are people who stay with the museum, they join a movement and they're part of that. And I think at this time, the museum District 6 Museum can really benefit from the slow work of community building relationships that it has done over the years, and will reap some of those benefits now, because I think its focus is going to be on how to hang on to those users and participants and how to adapt and listen to them as well. So just in terms of also how some of the adaptations in terms of the program, I think the museums should realize that it doesn't help that we just talk to each other on these online platforms as museum practitioners. There's one quote that I probably use far too much from Trinidadian historian, journalist, C.L.R. James, who says, "What does he of cricket know who only cricket knows?" And so we do need to look out, look up, look around, learn from the resilience of our communities, because people have reminded us that we've been through many things and we can actually advise you on that. So just in terms of, for example, an adaptation to a program that I know that the museum is working on at the moment is its archive and its oral history collection. So the museum is really built also on narratives, as other people have said. It's built on narratives, it's built on collecting stories of what life was like under apartheid, what life was like when people were forcibly removed, and still current impact. And this COVID reality is part of the current impact. And the strategy has always been to invite people into the space, because part of it was also the experience of being in the museum space, which was enacting a ritual of coming back to District 6. But the museum is busy kind of fine-tuning a strategy where it has to be aware of the risks involved in its elderly people coming out while we are on stage level 3 of lockdown. So everything is not open yet, but we're slowly opening up. There's still great risk attached to people with different age-related conditions such as diabetes, high blood pressure, and whatever else people suffer from. So the museum is working very much on its mobile strategy, going out to homes obviously following guidelines and protocols. And that is one way I know that there is some adaptation, that it's not going to be so much about inviting people into the space, but going out and then also working very much on its customized programs from its usual users, from schools and universities, different groups that usually come to the District 6 Museum.
Thank you, Bonita. Kenji?
For a small local history museum like ours, museums like ours, strengthening relationship with the communities is probably the most important thing that to increase the number of local visitors, and building trust, building relationships, engaging with their audience and communities, to know them, to know their culture, and that's pretty much all. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Paulina?
Sure. I think I want to pick up again on one of the concepts. I think that we have to be empathetic, have empathy. The last studies done, I think the situation here in Chile is pretty much the same all over the world, but the last surveys, the last studies made to know from people their cultural experience is that people are afraid to return to cultural spaces. Most of the people have answered that they feel safe to return to a museum in one more year, or when there's a vaccine available for COVID. So it's a really difficult situation to gain their trust again, to make them feel safe, to make them feel welcome to our museums. So I think the main question once again is, what are the boundaries of our museums? The museum experience is only limited to the physical space, to the geographic space, but I know that the aesthetics experience is not only related to the digital experience. So I think that we have to take up the boundaries of the museum and open it up and go to do some specific geographic work, especially in the neighborhoods, and to do work with specific segments of audiences, especially how House of Memories has done it. And I believe that also the example of the work that has been done for the team of the Pedro O'Neill Museum in Medellin, and I invite you all to see it, called Como Pedro por su Casa, is a really creative way to get the museum experience inside of people's houses. Thank you.
Thank you, Paulina. Carol?
Yes, just to add to colleagues' thoughts and comments there, I think it's not easy to reach out to the most disconnected and disadvantaged communities in our neighborhood. I think, as Bonita shared, context is really key. Where my museum is based, it's one of the most deprived regions in the UK. And the reality for my museum and the context is people do not think about museums as a strong feature in their lives. Why would they visit a museum where they're struggling with third generation unemployed, child poverty, poor skills, poor opportunity for employment? So I think it's really important that we understand that context, and through that understanding, I think how we approach engagement then will differ greatly from place to place. But I think we share the same principles and the same values. And it's about looking beyond, as Paulina has said, about looking up, looking beyond the walls of the establishment, and connecting where the community is based, and that will be through trust and true engagement. I think there is a real challenge here for museums to do this in a meaningful way. And I think it's hard and it's tough. And I don't think we should underestimate that commitment is will take time. But in my own practice, and where I see practice demonstrated here today, when we get that right, we can make a massive impact, and we do in fact change lives, and we position ourselves as a much needed social education asset for some of our poorest communities and young people and neighborhood. So it's essential that we do it, but we move from a position of understanding. The museum landing in your neighborhood for 6 weeks with a brilliant project is wonderful, but what happens next when the circus leaves town? And if you have that asset that is a building, make sure that as well as reaching out into the neighborhood, you create a real corridor where they can come in with confidence that you truly do understand what great engagement will look like for them.
Thank you all panelists. Again, the next question, I'm going to combine a few audience questions with what I had. So this time we'll go the other way. Maybe Carol can answer first, and then Paulina, then Kenji, then Bonita. We are at a time where public funding is going to get, probably less overall, for museums. I mean, that's a bit of a prediction based on GDPs going down, et cetera, et cetera. In this phase, how important is the local community for the long-term sustainability of museums in all aspects, including politically, financially, having, people and human resource support, et cetera? Whether you could, maybe throw some comments, Carol, and then we'll just go down to the other panelists. You're on mute, Carol.
Apologies. I think where, in my case, in the UK, my museum is publicly funded and taxpayers pay for the museum to exist, it's absolutely clear that we can work in a very effective way to form partnership with other public service assets. So the museum does not sit in isolation. It aligns itself with educational provision, with the development of skills and training for young people, where it creates creative spaces for up and coming artists and creatives, where we really position what we have at the heart of the development of the region and the community, so that we don't operate in isolation. And I think when we do that well, we can be part of that regeneration that comes with development to education, to skills, to employment. And we're seen as part of that journey for young people, for families to, develop their own lives and achieve better outcomes. And I think, particularly in my work that I've demonstrated today for our aging community, this is a population demographic that is going to hit us all in the next 10 to 20 years. We're living longer and we want to live well. And museums have a fantastic opportunity to explore that in terms of the experiences that we create. But again, as everyone has said here today, it can't be achieved in isolation. So relationships, influence, championing, in politicians, local dignitaries, people need to speak on our behalf. If we only talk to one another and praise ourselves, we'll feel great for a short period of time, but the validation that we receive externally from other public service leaders and advocates, that's so much more powerful. So we've got to work hard at staying connected.
Thanks, Carol. Paulina?
Vinod, for us, for the Latin American situation, especially in Chile, your question is like a knife through the heart. I want to take what Carol said, so how we can get audience and people involved to be our speakers. The local situation here in Chile is quite dramatic. Only a few museums have public funding. Chile has overall 400 museums, and 30 are public funding, 30 through 50. And it's quite complicated. We are now living in a time where culture is in crisis. We don't have the support of local government. We don't have the support of local authorities. So our workers, cultural workers from all the different activities, theater, cinema, museums, of course, are struggling and question themselves how to survive, because the question today is how to survive. The museums are in quite danger. That's the reality here in Chile, and I know that is the reality in a lot of my companions in Latin America. And what can we do? We have to get to people's hearts. We have to make them feel and see, like the question that I did. Can people live without museums? Yes, they can, but what kind of life is that? So I don't have the answer. I would love to have it, because now we are challenging, we're facing the most difficult crisis in the cultural sector in the history of our country. So I would love to get to know the experience of other places, but for us now, the main challenge is to get the government involved and to realize that a country without culture, a country without libraries, a country without museums cannot exist, because it's an essential part of their life. So that's our struggle in this moment.
Thank you. I'll move to Kenji.
Well, how important is the local community? Well, for the local community museum like ours, local community is everything. And but if the local community doesn't know the museum, and then they don't care about us, that's a nightmare. So if they feel that they want to support us, or we have to let them think in this way, we want to support the museum, and in whatever way they can, politically, financially, or human resource wise, we are relatively safe. So basically, as I said many times, creating better relationships, trust, that's a very important thing that for us as a local community museum. Thank you.
Thank you. Bonita?
So I think for a museum like District 6 Museum, which has a strong identity as a community museum, a museum which is independent and not state funded, the community is the lifeblood of the museum. Obviously, you cannot operate without funding. And I want to be very careful in what I want to say, but I almost want to say that losing money is easier to replace than losing community and losing purpose. But I'm not saying the money is not important, and so I'm very encouraged by the fact that there are so many people who are concerned about what is the future of District 6 Museum, what's happening to the memory of our city. The elders of District 6, they're in the 70s, 80s, 90s, who are sending messages and finding out and saying, we miss coming, when can we open again? How can we help? And these are not, I know these are not people, these are pensioners who survive on very little income. But I think in the past, we've seen evidence of campaigns that if you scale, if you have a large number of people supporting it, then small amounts of money, because people believe in that purpose, I think is a great thing to have. And so the museum, not to underestimate the financial impact of the loss of income, because tourists are the one, international tourists mostly, are the ones who pay entrance fees that helps to contribute to the museum. Local people who are who have been affected by forced removals, they don't provide income. There's a free entrance for them. So there's always a kind of a cross-subsidization between that. So I think it's about working in an agile way with that formula and trying to get it better. But I'm hopeful, because I think there's a lot of support, and it's just about finding the way of how you translate that support into resources to keep the doors open.
Thank you. The next question, I'm just picking one of the questions that someone's typed in. Any of the panelists can answer this one. How do you mobilize communities in situations where poverty is high, living conditions are tough? In those situations, you need to mobilize communities. How do you do that? Who wants to have a go at it? Go ahead, Carol.
In my experience, we all want to dream. We all, irrespective of our personal circumstances, and I myself, come from, quite a poor background where going to a museum or an art gallery just didn't even feature for my parents. But as a child, I still had dreams and ambitions. And what I see in terms of the museum that we've created in Liverpool is that we want to create somewhere safe where people feel that can happen and it has a worth. And maybe it allows them to escape the reality of everyday life. Maybe it inspires them to develop in some way. But maybe it creates a shared opportunity with, for families and for siblings and for neighborhoods. There's so many layers to that. But I think, in the way that Bonita was describing there, it has to be accessible in terms of means, affordability, and not tokenist and not patronizing so that you feel like you're a second class citizen if you're getting in free of charge. There are so many nuances to how we have that conversation, but I hold on to a belief from my own childhood that we all want to dream, and museums allow us to escape into the most amazing spaces. Histories are complicated, challenging, painful, but they can also really inform who we are as people and allow us to want to create a better world. So I hold on to that concept that our content is rich, and if our engagement is true, I think communities can benefit immensely from connecting with us.
Thank you, Carol. Does anyone else want to add to what Carol was saying? Thank you. I'll move to the next question. And this one, I think all of you can have a go. But the only thing is, make sure you don't name your institution. The question that has come up is, what's an example of a good community museum you can think of? Don't say your own museum. It's got to be some other museum other than your own museum. And the question is both physically as well as virtually. If you can think of two separate examples, that'll be great. Maybe I'll start from, myself. I've traveled quite a bit in the Pacific. One good example is the Vanuatu Cultural Center in Vanuatu. They don't even call it a museum. They call it a cultural center. It's the center for everything that happens, within that particular city. It's the museum. So it's a great place. I have great memories of going there. Over to you, panelists. Yep, go ahead, Bonita.
So I can think of two. I don't know why I suddenly hit a blank, because I've got a list in my head and I can't access that list. I think it's stage fright. But the one I can think of is the Jane Addams Hull House in Chicago, which I think uses really recreation of a past community that lived there. And they use narrative very beautifully also, recordings and stories. And on top of that, you get a sense of, it's not just telling a story of the past, because for me, that's always an important thing. It's how does it connect to people's lives now? And so there are also lots of public dialogues around contemporary issues in the community, which they're very good at. And if I can just also mention another one in South Africa, which is the Luandley Migrant Labor Museum, which tells the story of migrant labor under apartheid. It is located, it's a very brave museum. It's located within the community. They've used up one little hostel that could provide housing for an impoverished community, and where they had to deal with a lot of critique and feedback from the community who want to tell their story, but they also want housing. And so the way that I won't go into detail, but the way that they've dealt with it, I really think is great and brave. And they are one of the few museums, community museums in our country that are located in what we call a township.
Thank you, Bonita. Who wants to go next? Sorry, I'm trying to, I'm getting all the questions on WhatsApp, so I'm trying to read it at the same time. So,
Vinod, I'm going to take the.
Sure.
I'm going to answer. In the Chilean case, I believe that el Museo de la Solidaridad Salvador Allende, the Solidarity Museum of the former President Salvador Allende, is one of the most encouraging examples of how to work with the local community. They've been a museum that has a historic story related to the former president that died in the military dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet. They have been working with the local waivers, the needers. They have a social responsibility with the neighborhood. They are like a fellow companion of the community. They are open to the social concerns of the community. They do exhibitions or educational activities with underprivileged people or with senior citizens. So it's quite amazing what they've been able to develop. They are in a historic neighborhood and they are part of the community, like fully. And the other museum that I've been talking about on this presentation is Pedronel. I'm a huge fan of their work. I'm a huge fan of their workers team. And I really invite you to see what they're doing. So I believe that it's quite emotional to see the commitment of their workers to go to Medellin and to open up the museum and to take it to people's houses and to work with the local community and underprivileged people. So it's quite amazing.
Kenji, or who hasn't shared?
Okay. One of the community museums that I can think of is also located in Osaka. Not my museum, but it's actually a Hirano community-wide museum, which is an eco museum. I don't know if you can call it community museum, but it's an eco museum. It's basically the buildings and also the people around them. They are all part of the museum, and they are all curators, and they are basically not for the international visitors. They are not for the outsiders. They communicate with each other. They deepen understanding or deepen exchange in communication amongst with each other. So it's basically the eco museum for themselves. It's quite interesting approach. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. I have two examples. One is within the UK. It's a group of museums in the Highlands of Scotland, and I've been really impressed with the work that they create and enable with rural communities where there isn't access to a main museum in the centre. And the Highlands group are really effective of collecting stories, contemporary curating, connecting community groups in a very meaningful way. So all of the smaller stories of crofters and of neighbourhoods are represented within the wider regional museum understanding, and I just think it's a really smart way of working. And I also think it's important that when we think of museums, we don't just think of museums that are in major cities and towns. There are lots of rural settings that benefit from museum connectivity, but it has to be delivered in a very different way. So I think they're really good at it. And my other example is over in Minneapolis, in St. Paul, in Minnesota. I've been there a few times because they have a fantastic program working with elders in the community, and they're really effective at connecting directly with community leaders and building the trust that has been mentioned many times today, and the relationship in quite a fragmented community across a very challenging environment around Black Lives Matters. And I think what Minnesota has done really well is capture those stories from Black elders, the African American community, in a very powerful way, and so that their stories aren't lost or forgotten. And I think that's a great example of representing the whole of society. So they would be my two.
Thank you. Can I request all the panelists to just type in the names of the museum in your chat so that people could maybe have a look at it online or whatever. And I'll also open it up to Peter. Peter, do you have a favorite museum in this space?
Well, I was just thinking about it. One museum working very much with its community is the Women's Museum in Western Austria, in Hittisau, which is developing exhibitions, collecting objects and stories with the local community. But maybe I should write the name. Nobody would have understood it. Yeah. I should write the name in the chat.
Sure. I think that'd be great for us to compile a list of interesting museums that people can refer to. Thank you. I've got the very last question. I'm going to combine a number of things together. I think this pandemic, is going to be a difficult one in many ways. But I know Kenji mentioned about a COVID exhibition. Carol mentioned about certain things you do in terms of mental health and things like that. And I'm just wondering whether, maybe both of you can start with, but others can join in, is this whole aspect of COVID. How do you put a story that's factual, correct? Because there's so much dynamics to it. There is a political dynamic. There is a human dynamics. I mean, there's so much suffering, and, I think people have really struggled in all ways. I mean, how do you get the right story out? And the second thing is post, for the next few years, in terms of mental health, what could museums do for the local community in terms of what it does, in terms of, programs, events, and other aspects? So I'll just leave it open-ended. Maybe Kenji and Carol can start with them. The others can comment after that.
I'm happy to start. I think there will be many stories. It won't be one story. And I think it's going to be really important that museums recognize that there will be different layers to that story, not just in the diversity of what needs to be shared in terms of the experience of COVID-19, but the different ways in which that can be shared as well. I'm doing a lot of work with university partners at the moment to capture the impact of people's experiences of living with COVID at the moment, and that they are extremely diverse, but all of them are relevant because those stories belong to individuals. So I think there's a real need to create a contemporary collecting approach that is accessible to as many people as possible. And then I think we need to think very carefully and how those stories will challenge politically, and living in a democratic country, that's absolutely key that we do challenge, and because that's what history gives us, an opportunity to reflect and to think and to learn from past experience. So I think this moment of COVID is really important, and I would encourage all museums and Kenji mentioned, COVID jokes. There will be digitals. You only have to look at TikTok, that lots of young people in the UK are engaging with at the moment. It's a social media platform during COVID. People have been creative, imaginative, sharing ideas, that is a museum experience in its own right. So I think we have to think very differently about how we capture this moment and how we tell that story to different stakeholders, and how, if it is necessary, we do use those stories to challenge and learn.
Thank you, Carol. Kenji, do you want to comment anything?
Well, as far as I know, I only know less than 10 museums in Japan which are collecting objects, documents, and stories related to COVID-19. And our museum, or myself, is one of the few and the first people, the curators, who decided and who started collecting. And I am not going to put any stories, my own story, into these objects and documents. I am trying to collect as many objects and stories and narratives as possible from the people who experienced the sorrow and pain and anger, all the, kind of emotion, and try to share as many things and stories with the audience and the community as possible. And so in doing that, as I said, I'm not going to put my own story into that, and that's what I'm doing right now in the exhibition, which is on right now.
Thank you, Kenji. Bonita and Paulina, do you want to share anything?
Just to add on, I mean, as Carol was saying about there not being one story, there are many stories. And I think it's just about jacking up our strategies for how to present these and also how to engage with these stories. And I think very importantly, I think all museums should be, if they are involved in the business of collecting narrative, and also see themselves as being part of healing and recovery, I think it is also to tap into other modalities like art. So it's not just people telling their stories, using art, using pottery, using creativity in different ways to help people to also, I'm not saying that that's going to help and to heal people, but it will help to process. And I'm talking long-term now, because this is not all going to happen right now, but I think we mustn't forget that there are other modalities besides the verbal way of narrative, because there are many people who are not all that verbal, but they feel and they've experienced, and they also need a way to share that as well.
Thank you, Bonita. I think we are getting ready to kind of close the webinar. Paulina, do you want to add anything or? No. Okay. Thank you. So before I pass it on to Peter, let me thank the panelists. I think you've been a great panel. It's been a great discussion. Let me also really thank Marie and Carlos and Cesar for doing all the background work and putting it all together. So thank you so much. And for ICOM for hosting this webinar. I think ICOM's been doing a lot in this space. They've been, quite concerned, and they've been extremely reactive and positive. If any of those people who are viewing this, are interested in a particular topic that they would like us to cover in future, please email ICOM, email Peter. I think it'll be great. Over to you, Peter.
Thank you very much. It was fascinating to hear all these different insights from other parts of the world, and it's difficult to sum it up in a few words. Maybe I take out questions that were raised and look into the future, because some questions were about virtual museum. You took one question of Vinod about the role of objects. And one of our future webinars should be about online activities of museum. And there were many questions about the closures and job redundancies. The survey I referred to was about expectations, about respondents expecting museums to be closed or jobs to be lost. This must be a topic of a future webinar as well. I think job opportunities and challenges, because as it was said in the questions now, especially education staff is concerned, and young staff members, because they have limited contracts. So museums might lose a whole generation of professionals if this crisis continues. This should be a future webinar as well. I would like to thank the speakers of this webinar, going from east to west: Kenji Saotome from Osaka in Japan, Bonita Bennett from Cape Town in South Africa, Carol Rogers from Liverpool in the UK, Paulina Roblero from Santiago de Chile. Thank you, Vinod, for moderating this webinar again. Thank you to the team which made this possible. Thank you to all the participants. I saw participants from, again, around the world, from Asia, Africa, Mozambique. I saw from Europe and from the Americas. So thank you everybody for joining us, and look out for the next webinar. We will certainly offer you in the next months. Thank you.